Great, thank you. Okay, great. So here, let me pull up my PowerPoint. Here we go. Can you see it all? Is that working all right? Great. Okay, thank you all so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to get a chance to meet you all virtually. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Yeah, it's just lovely to get to meet people all over the world and get a chance to talk about the internet and social epistemology. So here's my plan for today, right? What I want to do is argue for a kind of social epistemology that I think is really useful for thinking about the internet. And I'm calling that socially situated epistemology of the internet. I want to argue that this approach helps us understand the current social media landscape we have, and also might really help us imagine better social media futures. So I'm excited about the possibilities of this. So what do I mean by this socially situated approach? Well, what I want to argue is that social epistemology needs to take account of race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, colonialism, capitalism, other forms of inequality and oppression. So socially situated epistemology of the internet centers issues of power and oppression. It avoids abstracting away from the different identities of users of the internet. So in this approach, I will tend not just to talk generically about users or people on the internet. I'll be talking about people in specific roles in specific parts of social hierarchies. And also, as Keith mentioned, right, this methodology that I'm going to be using will be really based on standpoint epistemology. I think we can really learn a lot from the internet by not just considering generic users or generic knowers, but starting from the lives of people who are oppressed. We're going to see a lot more interesting features of the internet that are going to be interesting to epistemologists. So my goal today is to demonstrate the value of this approach. I'm going to be drawing on the frameworks and arguments of my book that just came out last week. And then I'm going to be talking about some thoughts and ideas I'm working on about things that have happened since I finished the book. So in particular, today I thought it'd be interesting to talk about something that in the US people are talking about a lot. I'm curious to see, how this is playing out in your contexts. What's happened to Twitter since Elon Musk took over Twitter? And I'm not just going to be talking about Twitter. I'm also going to be talking about, okay, what are other social media platforms that people are trying to use? And what are some of the epistemologically interesting questions that come up? Okay, so to kind of set the framework for what I try to do in the book and the tools I'm going to be using going forward, in the book, I draw on these different sets of philosophical frameworks. So I draw on feminist accounts of objectivity. I think it's really helpful to think about how can we remove bias, manage bias in our knowledge systems that we're engaged in on the internet. And I think feminist theories really help us with that. Goldman's systems-oriented social epistemology using veritism, I think is really helpful. So I'm going to be thinking a lot about truths and also from the epistemology of ignorance literature, falsehoods and ignorance. So thinking about how our social structures of the internet can both spread falsehoods, but also help us acquire true beliefs, I think is really helpful for social epistemologists. The epistemic injustice literature is helpful for recognizing the ways in which various users with different kinds of marginalized identities are silenced or discredited on the internet. And I think virtue epistemology is really helpful for helping us think about how each of us as users can try to develop habits which are epistemically virtuous, which are going to help us both acquire knowledge on the internet and also spread it. And I'm also going to be interested in a kind of virtue epistemology that recognizes that the kinds of habits that we're encouraged to develop or the kinds of people that we are online are very much shaped by the social systems that we inhabit. So the book, right, as he mentions, applies these tools to content moderation, online imposture and hoaxes, fake news, lurking, and there's also an appendix on internet research ethics. I just mentioned that in case that's helpful for anybody working on these issues. So today I'm really going to be drawing on content from the chapters on the chapter on hoaxes and also the chapter on lurking, and seeing how some of those ideas might apply to things that have been happening in the past couple of months. So I'm going to briefly outline what's been going on with Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. Why should epistemologists be interested in this at all? I'm going to argue that there are some significant epistemic harms that have happened. Then I'm going to turn to, okay, given these harms, actually a lot of people are fleeing Twitter, and they're trying to find alternative social media spaces. Mastodon is a particularly interesting social media space that I've been interested in for a number of years. And I'm going to talk about, I'll mention briefly some of the promises of Mastodon, but I'm also going to talk about some of the problems that have arisen. And here I really want to signal boost some amazing work that Jonathan Flowers, philosopher of technology, has been doing in thinking about the whiteness of Mastodon as an alternative social media space. Then the last section, I'm going to head back to Twitter and see what's been going on in Twitter that's epistemically interesting since Elon Musk took over, that might be maybe interesting and positive in some ways. This will be a bit more of a fun section where we'll be talking about Twitter trickery and some of the chaos that has happened since Musk and his team implemented a certain kind of verification. Okay, so here's just some basics, facts. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. It seems like Elon Musk sort of decided to take over Twitter kind of on a whim, didn't really know what he was getting into. The acquisition was finalized in October of last year. There have been mass layoffs, mass resignations. Importantly for epistemologists, the human moderating team has been really decimated. So there's a lot fewer human beings involved in the decisions about which posts get taken out or who gets banned from the platform. The machine learning ethics experts, that team was completely dissolved and laid off. The human rights team was completely laid off. So there's a lot of concern about some of the ways in which the layoffs have removed a lot of protections that have been sort of useful, and I'll make an argument that they were epistemically useful. There's been a noted increase in hate speech, potentially due to some of these layoffs and problems, but also potentially some folks have argued because people are being emboldened by feeling that Twitter is now a space where they can say anything and they're not going to be punished. There's simultaneously been an exodus to other kinds of platforms, right? So folks are unhappy with what's happened, find that Twitter is no longer the space that it was, and they're trying to find alternatives. And there was also, as I'll talk more about in detail, in order to try and make money, Elon's team implemented a system where you could pay $8 a month and get a little blue check verification next to your name. This resulted in a ton of chaos, and I'll be talking about some of the details of that later. Okay, so why should epistemologists care about any of this? Well, one of the things that I've argued in previous work, right, is that online diversity is veritistically valuable. If we care about having epistemic communities that are able to spread true beliefs and identify falsehoods, then we should want our online communities to be diverse, because diverse online communities have, for example, marginalized members who are better able to identify biases, prejudices, falsehoods, which are often spread as a result of systemic ignorance or prejudice or lack of understanding. And if we don't have diverse online communities, certain kinds of knowledge is obscured, certain kinds of biases run rampant. So as epistemologists, we should really want diverse online communities. But hate speech, harassment, and I would argue also the loss of local content experts, like the human rights team, like content moderators who understand what people are trying to say in particular marginalized communities. The loss of these experts and the increase of harassment and hate speech decrease the diversity of Twitter, right? Activists around the world who no longer have a human rights team that is making sure that their speech is protected and they're not subject to state censorship or repercussions. Those folks are going to stay off of Twitter. Folks who experience harassment tend to remove themselves from online spaces. And so one of the reasons that we should care about the problems that Musk's team has taken over is that it's going to reduce the diversity of the community. The epistemologies of ignorance literature also helps us see this, because some of the replatforming of right-wing extremists that have happened, right? So one of the reasons why Musk said he was interested in taking over Twitter was because he's a sort of a free speech absolutist. He didn't agree with certain people being banned from Twitter. So there's been a lot of replatforming of transphobes, white supremacists, misogynists, right? These folks are now back on Twitter and able to spread disinformation, ignorance, which is something that the epistemologies of ignorance literature, ignorance literature, would really draw our attention to. And in terms of epistemic injustice, right, when there's an increase in hate speech and harassment, there's an increase in discrediting of the speech of marginalized people. There's a lot of testimonial smothering, to use Christy Dotson's term, right, which is coerced self-silencing. So if there's an environment in which I don't feel safe or I'm surrounded by ignorance, I might curtail my speech and not say things that I would say otherwise. So there's a lot of epistemic damage that has come from some of the actions that Elon Musk has taken. Now, one of the things I think is somewhat tricky as epistemologists when we think about social media is we're just sort of focused on, okay, the epistemic features of it, like what truths are being spread, what ignorance is being spread, right? What are people able to find out? And people do care about that, right? People come to the internet for epistemic reasons, but they also have a host of other reasons why they come. So people are fleeing Twitter, not just for epistemic reasons, but for plenty of other reasons. So in this next section, I want to talk about some of the reasons why people go to other alternative social media platforms and think about them as an epistemologist, but I also want to flag there are tons of other reasons why people are going to these places. So in response to Elon's takeover, many users have left for other social media platforms, and Mastodon, which is part of the Fediverse, and I'll give you some more introduction to these spaces in a minute. This has been a popular site. So Mastodon, I got an account on Mastodon like in 2017. It was a pretty small niche social media platform. It had around 300,000 users before Elon Musk took over Twitter, and it's had a really huge growth. So I checked just this past weekend, it now has 1.7 million active monthly users, and it's had a lot of growing pains. I mentioned that I'm going to spend more time on some of the problems with Mastodon, but I want to flag that part of the reason that I started looking at it is it's actually a very exciting for me social media alternative. So one of the interesting features about Mastodon is a completely non-corporate social media platform. So it runs on an open source protocol, which means that anybody who has a technological skill to can use this open source protocol, have their own servers, and essentially create their own social media space. If I had the technological know-how and the time, I would love to use this to set up a social media community. And then me and the people who are part of that community, we could determine our own moderation rules for the platform. We could decide who we want to include, what kinds of behaviors we're going to allow on the platform, and how we want this platform to run. And then we could host it on our own servers. And Mastodon does not allow advertising. So it's not run on a profit incentive. And there are lots of reasons to be very excited about this as epistemologists, right? We see a lot of the problems with our social media spaces are that they're run by a few corporate monopolies that are less interested in making sure that people form true beliefs and more interested in making sure that our eyes see advertisements. And so they do things like create algorithms which draw our attention to things which are maybe not the most useful or the most true. So I think there's a lot to be excited about with Mastodon. If you want, we could talk more about that in the Q&A. But today I want to talk about something that has also come up more in recent months, which is with these growing pains, right? Which is that there's a real problem with centering whiteness on Mastodon. And this is one of the things that I'm going to emphasize that Jonathan Flowers and a bunch of other people of color on Mastodon have drawn attention to. So there's a lot of socially constructed white ignorance and epistemic vice that we're seeing on Mastodon, which have made it feel like often a hostile place for people of color. And this is going to be what I'm going to focus on now, and I think has real epistemic problems. Okay, so just to situate this in the epistemology, right? The epistemologies of ignorance literature, and this is just like throwing at you to show that there's like tons of work here, right? Lots and lots of causes of socially constructed ignorance of privilege and prejudice. By that, I mean that people who are privileged, who have advantages in society, are often unaware of the privileges that they have and unaware of the disadvantages that other people have to deal with. And as we know, right, people are often unaware of their own prejudices. So there's a ways in which that ignorance is something that we're socialized into, that social structures perpetuate. And for me, one of the most important works in this area is Charles Mill's work on white ignorance. So for Mills, white ignorance is a non-knowing that has its causal origins in white racism or white racial domination. So what does that mean? Well, for him, a non-knowing could be either somebody having a false belief or somebody just having an absence of true belief. Like maybe I just don't even know anything about a particular topic. It's not that I have false beliefs about it, I just don't know. And for it to count as white ignorance would trace back the causal chain for why I don't have a belief or why I have a false belief. And there is part of that causal chain, white racism or white racial domination. It could be that white racism removed that information from the history books, something that seems to be happening a lot in the US right now, or I was prevented from knowing about that due to white racism. Or it could be, as one of the causes that we're going to talk about today, the silencing, ignoring, or discrediting of the testimony of people of color. So one of the things that Mills talks about is often there's information that's lost to the broader community because people of color's testimony, say for example about the racism that they're experiencing, is either discredited due to testimonial injustice, or they're silenced, they're prevented from being able to prevent their testimony. So for example, in the US, Black people not being allowed to like testify in court or be on juries in the past, right? Or also we could talk about the coerced self-silencing again, right? Where people have to curtail their speech in hostile environments. So if we take that from the epistemic injustice literature, I've argued in a previous paper that social media, while it has many problems, it's also an opportunity for privileged people to unlearn their ignorance, right? So as a white person, I can read stories by people of color and try and unlearn my prejudices or unlearn some of my uh, ignorance about my own privileges. And in the book, I talk about how online lurking is a kind of practice that we can all engage in that might be useful for unlearning some of this socially constructed ignorance. So what do I mean by lurking? So lurkers are people who listen to or read online communications without participating in the conversations themselves. So for example, I identify as a lurker. Back in the days when I was much more on Twitter, I intentionally made sure to follow trans folks, disability activists, people of color on Twitter to try and make sure, like, okay, so for example, during COVID, how are disabled people in my community feeling about whatever policy is being implemented, right? What are some things that I might be unaware of because I'm not experiencing the kind of disability that they are, right? So lurking in their conversations, reading what they're saying, watching videos, maybe on TikTok, that helps me unlearn some of the ignorance that I might have otherwise. And in the book, I argue that lurking can be a non-intrusive practice of listening. And I want to emphasize today the value of that non-intrusiveness, because that's one of the problems that's been happening on Mastodon. I also want to add another concept that I use in the book, and this is Shannon Sullivan's concept of ontological expansiveness. So she argues that this is one of the habits that white people are often socialized into. So she says, as ontologically expansive, white people tend to act and think as if all spaces, whether geographical, psychical, linguistic, economic, spiritual, bodily, or otherwise, are or should be available to them to move in and out of as they wish. And the ontological expansiveness is also illustrated when people are socialized to recognize only their interests, needs, and projects. And so just to give you an example of what she talks about, she gives an example from Patricia Williams, right, African-American woman who was on a tour of Harlem with a completely other white rest of the tour group. And the tour guide took them into a Black church without permission, without sort of asking, hey, can we come in? And they stood in the church and they kind of gawked and watched at the people in the church as sort of an interesting kind of voyeuristic activity, right? So this would be an example of feeling entitled to enter any space, right? So one of the things that Sullivan talks about is this manifests itself in lots of different senses of entitlement to enter spaces. And in the book, I argue that we also see this online. So I argue that online ontological expansiveness encourages white people to also feel entitled to occupy virtual space. So here's my funny meme, right? We've got this guy here. He says, that's right, you get in there and derail that conversation. It's not about you, but get in there and make it about you, right? So we often see practices of people having conversations within a particular community. People of color experience this all the time in blogs, on Twitter, in all kinds of spaces where they're talking about their experiences, and a white person comes into the comments and says, I feel attacked by this, makes it about their feelings, or asks a bunch of intrusive questions. And now the conversation is derailed towards addressing this person's needs rather than the conversation that was ongoing. back in the day when sort of blogs were more common, it's very common for people of color who had blogs to experience a lot of comment threads derailed and have to spend a lot of time doing moderation to deal with these problems. So we see manifestations of derailing and hijacking online spaces and conversations between people of color. So now I'm going to argue that this has been a problem on Mastodon, and this is in the past few months has created lots of epistemic problems. So let me just explain a little bit more about what Mastodon is and what it looks like. So remember I said that people can create their own social media spaces. So I have an account on this as sort of like the main Mastodon space, Mastodon Social, but some folks have also created a space for disabled folks, Disabled Social. They're also like interest grouped themes where people who want to talk about art are on Mastodon Art. Okay, it's federated social media, which means that if I'm in this particular instance, I'm not just stuck listening or talking to the people in this particular, and they call a social media community an instance. So if I'm in this community, I don't just hear from these folks. My community can also choose to federate with, which means share posts and you can read posts on the other communities. You can also choose to not federate with a community. So this is a hypothetical group, and there have been cases of this, like right-wing extremist groups, where they exist, but other groups, we don't want to federate. We don't want to read what they have to say, so we don't connect with them. So that's the broader structure of federated social media. This is just sort of what the desktop platform looks like. So similar to Twitter, you have your main feed. This is a bunch of sort of boring posts I picked from, I think, just to illustrate it. Over here, you can see the posts on your local group. You can also see the posts with other communities that your group federates with. Okay, this is going to be what's interesting over here. So this is what it looks like if you want to write a post. On Mastodon, a post is called a toot. So I would write what I want to say here. But there's this thing, and this is in the English language version, that says CW, which stands for content warning. So Mastodon has a feature which Twitter does not, which is that I can add a content warning, and I would write up here what the warning is, and it would hide my post behind that warning. So I did the sample just for you all. So if I wanted to say, hey, there's going to be some explicit content in this post, I might write explicit content. And then you wouldn't actually see what I had posted. It would be hidden behind it, and you'd have to click on show more, and then you would see what I had actually posted. So there's a long-standing norm of using content warnings on Mastodon. For a host of reasons, people on Mastodon had been using content warnings for lots of different things, not just like explicit content or violence, or maybe like saying, hey, this post contains information about alcohol, but also things like politics, right? So many people in the world are sick to death of constantly hearing about US politics. So it became I mean, who wouldn't want to be able to sometimes filter out conversations about Trump, right? So people were putting a US politics content warning, and then I could go through my feed and not have to see a bunch of political stuff. Okay, so this is a long-standing norm, and during the influx of new users, older Mastodon users tried to instill these social norms onto new users. Now, philosophers love to talk about social norms, and sometimes we talk about them in a very abstract way. We just talk about the norm and the people who are following these norms. But a socially situated epistemology requires us to look at how the social norms affect different users differently. And this is where I really want to draw on Jonathan Flower's work and the work of other people of color who have pointed this out. There's a important pattern on Mastodon of people of color being chastised for failing to add content warnings when they discuss their experiences with racism. So for example, new user to Mastodon comes, they want to post some experience of some racism that they encourage. And in their response, they got a lot of white people coming into their mention saying, you should have hidden this behind a content warning. Did you not know that we use content warnings here, and chastising them? People have also experienced punishment from moderators for failing to do this and for talking about racism. I saw one post where a moderator wrote like, racism should not be discussed on this platform, right? It's important to also note that this is also happening in the context of people experiencing hate speech, harassment, and bizarre moderation failings where moderators have sometimes punished people of color. For example, like that example I gave you where someone's like, you shouldn't be talking about racism on this platform. So there's kind of a hostile climate, and the harassment of people for failing to use content warnings is part of that. So Jonathan Flowers has a lovely podcast. You can read the transcript and listen to the podcast. It's called The Whiteness of Mastodon, and it's on the Tech Policy Forum. So here's just part of what he argued. Is that some of the arguments for content warnings, or at least a majority of them, at least in my view, come down to an attempt to preserve a particular white entitlement to comfort or freedom from racialized stress through the ways in which whiteness is held center as an inheritance of the platform. So part of his argument, right, is that whether they're aware of it or not, many of the white users who are chastising people of color for not using content warnings are doing it because they want an experience on Mastodon where they're not experiencing racial stress, where they're not having to be confronted with their own privilege or their own prejudices. And they want it hidden behind a content warning so that they can just scroll past it. And I want to analyze this in terms of these concepts of white ignorance and ontological expansiveness, right? So one of the epistemic problems with this pattern is that we want to recall that one of the causes of white ignorance is the silencing, ignoring, or discrediting of the testimony of people of color. So what that means for me, right, is that the drive for comfort and the demand for content warnings for discussion of racism can cause white ignorance, right? Like if a lot of discussion of racism, that testimony from people of color is hidden behind the content warning, a lot of people are just going to scroll right past it and aren't going to see it. So again, that's the ignoring of the testimony, which can cause white ignorance, like the non-knowing of certain kinds of things. But it can also be caused by it, right? So a kind of white ignorance, a lack of understanding of what it feels like to experience racism and to be constantly pressured to not talk about it or hide it, or be sort of like wanting to talk to your community and having people come in and sort of prevent that conversation from happening. That can be part of the cause of why people, I think, are going into the spaces of people of color and making these demands. I also think that it's helpful to analyze this as a kind of ontological expansiveness, right? White people's sense of entitlement to ask people of color to add content warnings, I think, is an example of ontological expansiveness. It suggests a drive to center their own particular needs, their own desire for comfort, their own entitlement to enter this person's mentions and talk about these things. So I think this is a really complex problem, right? And this is something that Flowers mentions in his really great work, right? Is this isn't going to be just solved by a technological fix, right? This is a kind of place where social epistemology needs to recognize that we both have a technological feature, right? An affordance, creation of a content warning, which might be useful in lots of ways, but it's also running into problems due to particular behaviors which are shaped by broader social structures. And here I'm sort of proposing, and I'll be curious to see what you all think about this, the virtue epistemology might be useful here, right? So one of the things I talk about in the book is how we as lurkers really need to think quite carefully about what kinds of virtues or behavioral patterns or habits we want to think about when to lurk and when to engage, when to be, how can we identify whether this is a conversation where it would even be appropriate to lurk in the space, or is that kind of creepy or voyeuristic for me to be lurking in the space? When is it appropriate for me to enter a conversation, or when am I going to be doing damage to a conversation or an epistemic space by entering that? So I think being able to develop context-sensitive habits that are attentive to issues of oppression and power could be one part of dealing with some of these problems that we're seeing in the growing pains of Mastodon. Okay, I'm now going to move into, so that was pretty heavy. There's a lot of, I think, really difficult issues that comes up here. I'm going to take a brief moment and talk about something that's a little bit more lighthearted, which is some of like the funny examples of trickery that have been happening on Twitter. So let's talk about Twitter blue check. So in November of last year, Twitter released the $8 subscription plan for getting a blue check, and they didn't include identity verification. So let me explain what I mean by that. So if you've been on Twitter previously, celebrities, corporations, notable people could apply to Twitter and ask them to give them a blue check, little circle with a check in it next to their name, and that would tell you, okay, this really is Tom Cruise's Twitter account, or this is Joe Biden's actual real Twitter account, so that you would know who was actually behind the account. To try and make money, partly because he needs to service all of the debt from having bought Twitter, Elon Musk wants people to be paying a subscription plan for this. And they said, okay, if you pay $8 a month, you can get the blue check next to your name, but they didn't verify anybody's identity. So this had been predicted by people, and it completely failed to take into account the internet's tendency for satire and humor. So numerous tricksters created fake accounts of celebrities and corporations. There's tons. Some of them are pretty funny. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So Eli Lilly is a huge pharmaceutical company, and somebody created a fake Eli Lilly company, and you can see it's got the fake. They paid $8 to get the fake little check next to it, and they tweeted out, "We're excited to announce insulin is free now." In the US horrific healthcare system, many people can't afford to buy insulin. For people who are even on Medicare, it costs on average $54 a month. Many people who don't have health insurance are paying hundreds of dollars a month for insulin in this country. So I'll talk more about how this sort of humorous tweet I think is really epistemically interesting. It was also socially significant, right? So Eli Lilly freaked out when this happened. Their stock price went down. It's hard to tell whether it went down specifically related to this tweet. They pulled all advertising revenue from Twitter as a result of this tweet. Here's another example of a hoax against a company. Somebody created a fake Chiquita banana account and tweeted, "We've just overthrown the government of Brazil." And then they, after that, tweeted, "We apologize to those who've been served a misleading message from a fake Chiquita account. We have not overthrown a government since 1954, right? Making or drawing attention and making fun of the fact that Chiquita Banana was involved in the CIA's overthrowing of the government of Guatemala in 1954. That Chiquita has been involved in paying of terrorist organizations in, I think, Colombia. Okay, so there were tons of these, and you can look them up, of like satirical accounts as a result of this platform change. I think this is a really epistemically interesting thing to dig into. Thinking about online authenticity is something that I do in the book, and it's complicated in ways that I think we really need to be able to think about issues of power and context. So in the book, I talk about how online imposters can often do significant epistemic harm, especially when they impersonate marginalized people. So I'll give you an example of that. This is a hoax way back from 2011. This is actually the hoax that got me fascinated about internet epistemology. So there was a blog called A Gay Girl in Damascus. It presented itself as a blog by queer Syrian American Amina Araf, who was living in Damascus, writing about her life as an activist in what was then the Syrian uprising, which is now turned into the civil war. And it was a really widely read blog in the West, in part because there was a lot of state censorship of activists at this time. And people in the West wanted to understand what was really happening in the uprising. So they read Amina's blog, journalists interviewed who they thought was Amina. And it turned out that there was no such person as Amina Raff. It was written all by this person here, Tom McMaster, who was an American living in Edinburgh at the time. This is a really epistemically damaging imposture. And imposters like McMaster often take the place of real marginalized people in networks of trust. So for example, journalists, people were reading this fake blog instead of reading the tweets, Facebook posts, or other communications of real, authentic Syrians during the uprising, real queer people in that community. So there's an occupation, a taking up of space, a trust in them. Also, the kind of content that such imposters often produce when they adopt the identity of marginalized people often tends to spread biases and stereotypes. So a lot of the stuff that McMaster posted actually reinforced problematic stereotypes about women in the Middle East, and they can spread tons of biases. So there's lots of epistemic damage that internet imposters do. I mean, we're familiar with this concept even more now as we're really concerned about disinformation in the recent years and concerns about fake news. So in response to this kind of examples of inauthenticity, disinformation, violations of trust, there's often a very quick response that many people have, which is that, well, we need to make sure to have really rigorous verifications. So for example, Facebook has a real names policy, so you have to use your real name, quote unquote real name, the name that matches like a government document on Facebook. And many people are like, we need to be able to make sure that everybody is using their offline identity on the internet. But I've argued in a paper that we really need to be sensitive to the context and different issues of power, right? So demands that everybody use their real name on social media ignore the fact that for many people, there are really important social consequences for sharing what they know online. And that often pseudonyms or anonymity can be important protections for people and enable them to share knowledge, which we can give uptake to, which we can share, we can learn from. They can help us identify biases and errors under the protections of anonymity, and that requiring real names for everybody, we're not all equally protected and able to do that. So I think thinking about some of these issues of authenticity also got me thinking about actually how trickery can sometimes be epistemically valuable, again, if we look at the context and who's doing it. So in the book, I talk about some tricksters who have been using the internet for hoaxes for years in ways that I think are epistemically really interesting and quite valuable. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this example, and then I'll see if you think that this kind of example and the lessons that I want to learn from it apply to what's been happening on Twitter. Okay, so the Yes Men are a group of artist activists who use both in-person and online elaborate hoaxes to draw attention to social issues that they think are not being paid attention to. So for example, this is a climate change centered hoax. So at the COP15 climate conference, which was in Copenhagen in 2009, they perpetrated a hoax beginning with a fake website and press release. So they created a fake website that looks like it's from the Canadian government. I know this is kind of fuzzy, so I'll explain it what they're saying. But they said that Canada is going to drastically reduce their climate emissions, and they're also going to create a large fund to help poorer nations deal with the consequences of climate change. So this fake website made that announcement. They also partnered with activists from Uganda to create a fake press conference. So this is a Ugandan activist pretending to be a representative from Uganda, thanking a fake representative of the government of Canada for creating this, right? Making the case for why Canada has been doing harm and agreeing with them that this is a positive step forward. They then used fake Twitter accounts to spread this press release. They created fake articles. I can't remember if it was like the Wall Street Journal or something, like fake newspaper articles, and drew attention to it. And it got a lot of uptake. So this is a nice newspaper article, Hoax Slices Through Canadian Spin on Warming. I'll read the little subtitle because I know it's small. The Yes Men forced Canada to say no. No, it would not adjust its plans emissions cuts to make them the toughest in the world. And no, it would not commit $13 billion and much more in the coming years to help the world's poorest countries adapt to the ravages of a warmer planet, right? So not only did they draw attention to this issue, they helped sort of recast our recognition that actually this is something that Canada is refusing to do, right? That becomes a truth that we're better able to access as a result of the hoax. So the Yes Men have interesting stuff to say about how satire can often draw attention to the truth. So this is a quote from one of the Yes Men. The goal of satire is not to make people believe something that's false, but rather to get them interested in discovering the truth. So I think, for example, this COP15 hoax is both veritistically valuable in that it draws attention to the truths that Canada is not doing these things. And there's also utility if we take objectivity as a central epistemic value, which is it balances out the bias in climate deliberations, right? So often climate deliberations, richer nations have more of a voice. Corporations can engage in lobbying and advertising to get their message across well. Marginalized people, poorer countries have a harder time getting their voices as part of the conversation. So the conversations become rather biased. So I think there's a lot of epistemic value to this hoax. Similarly, I'm kind of interested in how this blue check verification system actually created the opportunities for some veritastically valuable and objectivity increasing satire and trickery, right? So this Eli Lilly hoax drew attention to the fact that pharmaceutical companies could choose to reduce their prices. They absolutely could do it, and they're choosing not to, just as Canada was choosing not to reduce their climate emissions, right? It drew attention to this. This tweet enabled politicians like Bernie Sanders in the United States to be able to talk about some of the problems with pharmaceutical pricing, right? It's also a way for sort of like individual users to be able to gain, like satire, because it gains a lot of tension because people love jokes on the internet, can enable individuals to gain a voice when often corporations are the ones who have advertising dollars and can take over our epistemic spaces. So one of the things I value about socially situated epistemology is it can recognize that context and power dynamics shape the epistemic consequences of online trickery. I want to take an approach which is not just like we all need to use our real names all the time and we always need to be authentic. Sometimes trickery and hoaxes can have epistemic values, and it matters how norms of authenticity are imposed, how they're enforced, who's tricked, and what we're learning from trickery. So I think a socially situated epistemology of the internet helps us provide nuanced analyses that are less susceptible to counterexamples. So for example, when folks argue that we all need to use our real names online and that will somehow make it a better epistemic space, I think there's clear counterexamples to that, like people we lose, people for whom it doesn't become a better space. One of my concerns about the kind of approach to social epistemology where we just talk about generic users it's often that marginalized people's lives act as counterexamples to the kinds of claims we end up making as philosophers. And I kind of think it's strange that sometimes as epistemologists we love creating the most abstract hypothetical counterexamples, right? Gettier problems, people with coins in their pocket, etc. But we're less willing to accept actually marginalized people as counterexamples. That if a theory doesn't work for marginalized people, then there's something wrong with that theory. And I think that that's an important part of socially situated epistemology. This kind of approach helps us recognize that there are many ways to advance epistemic goals, such as truth and objectivity. So in conclusion, right, so part of what I've tried to argue today is that the tools of social epistemology can be really fruitfully applied to the internet. And I hope you've seen that this is a really complex set of issues to deal with, right? We need to be able to talk about the things at multiple levels. Platform design matters. It matters whether we have the affordance to use content warnings. It matters how the blue check is being policed or applied to us. Social norms matter, right? We need to be able to think at the level also of norms and what we expect of each other. And also individual habits matter. But also at all of these levels, context and power matters. So I'm hoping, right, with this kind of approach, social epistemologists can help us imagine alternative social media futures that are less dominated by corporate monopolies, less susceptible to the whims of billionaires. It's one of the things I find exciting about Mastodon. Social media futures which are more just and less hostile to marginalized people. I think that's epistemically valuable as well as just something that justice demands. And I also hope that we can have social media futures which are able to keep the humor of the internet and recognize multiple ways to spread truths online. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Here are my references. Thank you.